The night the village gathered to say goodbye, women sat in soft groups murmuring prayers. Fatima's family home had filled early with neighbors and kin, a steady stream of people coming and going, some to offer condolences, others simply to stand with the family in silence. Her illness had been quick in its cruelty. Within a week, she had gone from bending over the stove and greeting neighbors at the gate to lying still and pale beneath a sheet. The local doctor had pronounced her dead just after midnight. The family had accepted it. The next duty was clear and immediate: wash the body, shroud it, and bury her before the heat of the sun came. They carried her carefully into the small room at the back of the mosque where the women gathered to perform the ghusl, the ritual wash. The room had no windows and smelled of soap and rose water. Clay jugs, basins, and clean cloths were ready. Zainab, who had washed many bodies in her life, began quietly reciting verses while she prepared the water. Her hands were old and steady. Beside her stood Amina, younger, who had been taught by Zainab and who kept her mouth moving with soft prayers to ease the tension in her chest. Fatima lay on the plank in the center, hair wet from the fever that had taken her, face pale as paper, hands folded at her sides. Her family hovered at the threshold, weeping softly, holding one another like fragile things. They began the ritual. It was respectful, careful, a motion that the women had done 100 times. Water poured, the first bowls slid over hair and shoulders, the cloth scrubbed gently at the dust of this life. Women recited surah and short dua, the room wrapped in the rhythm of words. Outside, a baby cried, and the sound threaded into the small space like a reminder of life. Inside, however, the air felt heavy. People in the family could not keep their eyes from the body. 2 of Fatima's grandchildren stood by the door, small shoulders shaking when the women's voices faltered. Then something odd happened. At first, no one understood what they were looking at. Aisha, who had come to help because she had been with Fatima in the afternoons, reached to adjust the white sheet over her chest and felt something that did not belong. The skin under her hand was not as cold as it should be. There was an almost faint warmth, like a cup that had been long insulated. She froze. A sound escaped her mouth so small that the others might have missed it if they had not already been on edge. "Did anyone else?" Amina began. "Keep calm," Zainab hissed, though her whisper shook. "Do not frighten the family." They pressed on, repeating the steps they always took, as if routine could save them from fear. They poured water again. The basin clinked against the plank and the tiny vibration seemed to echo in the room. Then Fatima's lips trembled. A soft sound, almost a sigh, escaped. It was so small that some who stood at the door thought their ears were playing tricks. But when the second bowl came, the sigh became a cough. Water spilled from her mouth. The women recoiled. One of the younger girls dropped the jug and it shattered on the stone floor with a loud crack that cut through the hush. For a long, frozen moment, no one moved. The only noise was the drip of water from broken clay and the ragged breathing from a woman who had been declared dead. Her eyelids fluttered. Her chest rose faintly. The first thing Fatima did was to try to sit up, and her hands found her daughter's sleeve as if reaching for something to hold on to in a dream. When the family realized she was alive, the room broke in a single instant from solemn routine into bedlam. Men who had been outside the door raced in. Some fell to their knees and wept openly. Others trembled and crossed themselves, eyes wide. The doctor who had signed the death certificate, summoned at a run, knelt in the doorway. He looked and then looked again, searching the face he had touched hours ago to confirm that the heartbeat he had measured with clinical steadiness was now faint but present. "How can this be?" he said aloud, and the question spread like a second shockwave. Fatima coughed till tears wet her cheeks. She moved, and then she whispered a sound that all who heard would never forget. "Allahu Akbar." The voice was thin but real. For those who had been in the room, there was no space for doubt. She was there, in the flesh. People kissed her hands and the hem of the white cloth. Some bowed their heads and cried loudly. Others could not move. The neighbors who had been waiting outside wept and offered praises. A call went out to the imam, then to the mayor, and within an hour the simple event that had happened in a quiet washing room spread like a flame through the village. Word traveled beyond the village within the day. Phones were still not common in every household, but those who had them made the rounds. A photo was taken, a shaky, whispered video, and sent from person to person until by morning the story reached the town and then the small city beyond. A journalist from the provincial paper arrived the next afternoon. He stood at the open door of the house, taking in the scene while his recorder stayed silent. The way the women moved around Fatima, touched hands, the way her son sat with his face cupped in his palms, this was not the kind of human moment you could recreate in an office. It was raw, immediate, and every face in that room demanded to be believed. Fatima's description of what she had experienced was broken by weakness and tears, but the pieces she gave left everyone speechless. There was light, and then a narrow path, she told those who gathered. I heard voices, I saw people calling my name, and I thought I had reached the end. Then something like a rope of light pulled me back, and a voice said, "Return, it is not your time." She shook as she spoke. I do not know who said it, but I came back to the world and found my family weeping. Doctors offered a different account, pressing for medical explanation. The young physician from the district hospital said quietly, "We have seen cases of apparent death where spontaneous respiration resumes after resuscitation measures. Sometimes hypothermia, faint pulses, or cardiac arrest can be temporary. But in this case, she had no pulse. I confirmed it. She was, by our tests, dead." The room listened. If the doctor was honest, then something beyond current scientific understanding had occurred. Or there had been an error the medical field could not at once explain. As the first stunned days passed, people came with questions. Some came to seek blessing, to touch the cloth that had covered Fatima. Others came to see whether rumor matched reality. Small offerings were left at the door. A loaf of bread, a jug of milk, a bouquet of marigolds. The imam sat with the family, and he addressed the crowd with a calm that steadied many. "Whether by Allah's sign or by the course of nature, we do not judge quickly," he said. "But we do know that what you see is a reminder. The world is thin between life and death." Not all reactions were reverent. A few in the town grumbled about the gathering and about the new attention. They did not want crowds clogging the streets or their daily routines disturbed by pilgrims and journalists. Others were suspicious. Maybe they staged it for attention, they muttered. Maybe the family wanted money or charity. The old habit of suspicion rose where fear had not. Yet for many, what mattered was not the reason but the effect. For the weeks after Fatima's return, the mosque was fuller at dawn than it had been in years. Old men who had not read Quran in a long time unrolled prayer mats and wept openly. Couples reconciled after long quarrels. A small woman who had borne a grudge carried bread to the house and apologized to her neighbor. Scientists from the city hospital came to examine her, wrote notes and took measurements, spoke of pulse rates and metabolic activity. They performed blood tests, X-rays, an electrocardiogram and found nothing overtly unusual. No poisoning, no lingering infection causing falsified readings. The region's chief physician was cautious. "Medicine is careful," he told a crowd who came to the outpatient clinic. "But it is not a closed book. There are phenomena we cannot explain yet. Let us record, then learn." He ordered a full report and promised publication. For a little while, the village became, rather reluctantly, a subject of professional curiosity. Religious scholars arrived as well. A well-known sheikh came from the city to speak with Fatima and to offer a theological frame. He sat by her bed and listened with a face that betrayed neither certainty nor impatience. "There are many signs through time," he said, "and it is not for us to rush to a single verdict. The Quran speaks of those whom Allah returns so that the living may be reminded. Perhaps this is such a mercy." He added a caution. "We must not build worship around a human being. Respect what Allah has shown. Use it to bring closeness to the Creator." Some of the family's neighbors held a different conversation behind closed doors. They noticed small changes in Fatima after the event. She rose earlier. She prayed with a quiet fierceness. She gave away some of the spoils left by curious visitors. The house became a center for gifts. People arrived at her door with small packets of sugar or rice, and she gave them away again. She stopped wearing jewelry and spent hours sitting at the mosque door, answering questions from those who had been awake all night thinking of death. Weeks blurred into months. The initial swirl of journalists and doctors slowed. The province's publication printed the physician's careful note. An extraordinary case that required more study, but in which the human element could not be overlooked. The sheikh's sermons spread on a local radio clip that people replayed in their kitchens as they stirred stew. Children who had been too young to understand what happened asked questions with astonishing frankness. "Were you scared of dying?" one small boy asked Fatima when he sat on her veranda, swinging his legs. She answered with the simplicity that had marked so many of her remarks. "I was frightened, but then I felt something pull me back. I don't know why. I just know I got another chance." That phrase, "another chance," became a small mantra in the village. People began to set old disputes aside. Debts that had hung open for years were forgiven more often than they were litigated. The neighborhood's petty quarrels cooled, as if the day itself had demanded gentleness. In local shops, more food was given to those who had little. There was a surge of quiet charity. The municipal council, moved by the change, organized a small festival not long after, where people shared bread and stories about the woman who returned. Not everyone thought the change was entirely good. A pastor from a small congregation in a nearby town warned against turning the event into a cult of personality. "We must not venerate a human being," he said in a small meeting of interfaith leaders. "The ethical value is to be reminded of mortality, not to hold the person up as an object of worship." The imam agreed and used his sermons to reinforce that the miracle was a call back to God, not to Fatima. Fatima herself was troubled by the attention. She rarely spoke of the experience more than she had to. "I did not die for myself," she said once, in a quiet moment when the journalist asked a pointed question. "I do not know why I was spared. I only know I could have been gone, and now I am here. I must not waste it." She began visiting the sick at the hospital, bringing small parcels of fruit and engaging with people as if each conversation were the last one she might have. She reconciled with a cousin she had not spoken to in years. She went to the family of a young man who had died in an accident and sat with them, offering presents more than words. One rainy afternoon, an idea came to the mayor and a committee was formed to document the story properly. A young researcher from the university sat for hours in the living room, taking down accounts of the doctor who had pronounced death, of the women who had been washing the body, of the first neighbor who had seen Fatima's hand twitch. The research collected not only physical descriptions but small moments. A neighbor who had whispered salawat at her side, the elder who had slipped a supplication into the washing basin, the son who had not eaten for 36 hours waiting at his mother's bed. The researcher published the oral history in a local journal, and the story traveled to academic circles, interested in experiences at the edge of death. They argued and wrote and debated, and the village found itself the center of a strange kind of pilgrimage. Time softened the strangeness. The crowds dwindled, and daily life returned. Fatima began to age as we all do. Her hair silvered. She walked slowly with a cane, and yet she kept a light in her face that people found comforting. When she passed again, years later, it was a gentle passing in her sleep. The whole town gathered for the funeral. This time, there would be no frantic rush to wash her body, no stunned calls to the doctor. The church bell across the lane tolled softly as the funeral prayers echoed in the mosque. The imam spoke not only about death, but about the duty of those who remain, to be kind, to forgive, and to remember the thin veil that separates the worlds. When the grave was filled and the family returned, there were stories. People remembered the first wet bowls at the mosque, the shattered jug at Amina's feet, the gasp that had set the town to weeping. Children who had been small at the time had grown up hearing the tale like a fable. They asked their parents what it meant. Was it a miracle? Was it a mistake? Was it a science we did not yet understand? The answers were imperfect, but they were earnest. Years after, travelers still came to the old house and the mosque where the washing had happened. They left small notes and a sprig of greenery. Some came simply because they had read a passing line on the internet. Others came because their hearts demanded to witness a place where a life had been granted one more day. The mayor, older now, would sometimes walk by the grave and sit in the quiet that the village had cultivated. He told his grandchildren the story as if it were both a warning and a blessing. In the end, nothing definitive was ever pronounced beyond the simple facts. A woman had been declared dead. While being washed, she returned to life. She lived for a new time and then, years later, died peacefully. The physicians produced a careful report of the case. Theologians offered sermon after sermon. Journalists published pieces that traced the rise of the village from rumor to reverence. Yet, the most important effect was less official. The villagers learned, in the small and stubborn ways of daily life, that the world was not made only of what could be weighed and measured. They found themselves kinder, more patient, and less quick to anger. With each meal shared and each neighbor forgiven, the memory of that single night did what reminders often do. It changed little things. On Dawood Street, where Fatima had lived, a narrow almond tree threw its shade across the stone wall. Children played under its branches. When asked about the story, the old ones would smile and say, "You must live as if you could be called at any moment." The young ones would giggle and keep throwing stones into the dust, too busy to grasp the full weight of what had happened. But when any of them grew to stand looking out over the fields, the story of the woman who came back at her washing would be there, waiting, a thin beacon to the life that passes in and out of our hands like a breeze. And in the quiet of some nights, when the wind comes and the lamps are low and the world seems very small and soft, an old woman's voice is still remembered saying, half to herself and half to a God who hears everything, "We are only travelers. Be gentle with others. The road is short."